we've done is create this Scano, Great Law Peace Center. It looks more intimidating than it actually is. It's just pronounced Scano in Onondaga. And it means peace and wellness. It's a part of a welcoming greeting in the Onondaga language. Noñh Scano is the full greeting. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it just means thank you for being well. But the principle of Scano is that wellness comes when human beings are in proper relationship to the natural world. And so that's one of those are the values we want to highlight at the Scano Great Law Peace Center. We all know Onondaga Lake as the most chemically polluted lake in the country. But for Haudenosaunee people, it's a sacred place. And for those of you who don't know about history of religions, we deal with the nature and issues of the sacred, which is a highly volatile affair. Anytime you talk about the sacred, it's complicated. So we'll get to the decolonizing part, and I think you'll appreciate what we're trying to do. So Haudenosaunee refers to people of the longhouse or people making the longhouse. They've been referred to for the last 400 years as the Iroquois, which is a kind of a French-derived term, not a very nice one actually, turns out. So the word that they prefer to call themselves is Haudenosaunee. And if you're in, we're trying to develop this center, right? And you have to balance attracting people who don't know anything about the Haudenosaunee with kind of using these old terms. And so it's sometimes difficult. Should we use Haudenosaunee? Should we use Iroquois? We err on the side of Haudenosaunee, particularly since we're working with the Onondaga Nation on this. Confederation, the Haudenosaunee are really they're not a tribe, but rather a confederation of individual nations, originally 5 and now 6. Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Tuscarora, and Seneca, and that wampum belt, which you've seen all over, which is now the flag that we were just talking about, is the origin belt. And what the belt represents is what happened at Onondaga Lake over 1,000 years ago. So that's really a kind of map as well as a kind of a principle, a series of principles. Among the Haudenosaunee are the last traditional governments in the United States that is at Onondaga here particularly. They've rejected the Bureau of Indian Affairs government, so they have they're still governed by the ancient matrilineal clan system, and we'll talk more about that. Also, what came out of the lake was the influence to Western democracy and influence on the women's movement. Right here is depicted a longhouse that extends across upstate New York. This is a graphic from the Onondaga Nation. The Mohawk or the Eastern Door, Oneida. Onondaga is the central fire. Cayuga, Seneca, and now Tuscarora up near Niagara Falls area. Okay, so the Onondaga Longhouse, referred to as the central fire because that's where the Grand Council comes to meet occasionally. So all the clan chiefs, the 49 clan chiefs in Tadadaho come together and meet periodically on issues facing the entire Confederacy. I won't go too much into this, but they generally talk about the 3 messages at Onondaga. The first is when they're given their ceremonies, the Thanksgivings as they call them. The second is the Great Law of Peace, which happened at Onondaga Lake over 1,000 years ago, and a series of wampums and a protocol on how to govern themselves. And then finally the Gaiweo, or what's called in English the Code of Hanson Lake, a prophet from the late 18th century, early 19th century, who traveled all through Haudenosaunee territory, promoting or getting them, teaching about his visions. One of the first instructions is the Thanksgiving address, and oftentimes they talk about it as, even though it sounds like a prayer, it's not. It's an address to other elements of creation. So human beings are thanked, as well as other beings that populate the world and the greater cosmos. And that's a protocol that's delivered before and after every significant meeting of the Haudenosaunee. So in the Longhouse or not, that's given. So these are we've got six different moments that we focus on in the Scano Center. And we've got a film, like a little small, short 4-minute film that's associated with each of these different aspects of Haudenosaunee culture. And oddly enough, it's the high-tech environment of video and touch screens that allows the visitor to get a first-hand account from the Haudenosaunee perspective, the leadership of the Haudenosaunee, to recite or talk about each of these values as we go through. And you'll notice that the first 4 are dedicated to pre-contact. So in some respects, for example, Tadadaho Sid Hill, who's been very involved with this project, he says in some respects this is going to be our Holocaust Museum. But if you've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you don't learn a lot about Judaism, right? And that's been one of the difficult hurdles, I guess. So what we wanted to do was introduce people to the Haudenosaunee value system and the different difficulties that they've had to overcome to get there before European contact. And that becomes more apparent. And then the takeaway in the end is the influence of what happened at Onondaga Lake to the rest of the world, right? So we'll probably go through this stuff a little later. So the Scano Great Law Peace Center is a collaborative, and collaboration sounds great until you actually try to do it. That's what I say. So my job was to bring county and the Onondaga County and the Onondaga Nation together around certain kind of core issues. And there's not a lot of love lost between the two, oftentimes, particularly around issues regarding the lake. So that was our challenge. But the Scano Center is basically a county parks facility. It's been called, for the last 80 years, has been called the French Fort. Anyone who's grown up in the area knows the French Fort. Then it transitioned in 1990 into St. Marie among the Iroquois. So we actually have a fort out there. But it was always the view of the Haudenosaunee through the Jesuits and their visit here to Onondaga Lake. They were only here 20 months from 1656 to 1658. And yet the French fort's been there over 80 years. So that's the decolonizing part of what we're trying to do. We're trying to take this icon of Syracuse, which is the French fort, and turn the meaning of it about 180 degrees, so that by the time you get to the fort, you have a different sense of what that might mean from a Haudenosaunee perspective, right? So all these different institutions have been involved. It's managed by Onondaga Historical Association. They've contracted with the county. We had a group that was of scholars from SU, Lemoyne, which is a Jesuit school, OCC, Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation, ESF, and Empire State College. And then the Onondaga Nation had control over the narrative. That, to me, I think is completely unique, that is, it's a county facility, but the nation has control over the final say. So as I said, it's a former St. Marie among the Iroquois site, French fort, renamed in 1990, and as I said, they were only there for less than 20 months, and then it was defunded by Onondaga County in 2011, and I don't really know why, but it was standing empty by the time we got to it. I wrote a letter to the editor of the Post-Standard. I said, there's a much more important story to tell about Onondaga Lake as a sacred place. That it was the founding place of the Haudenosaunee in many ways. It's among a series of sacred sites throughout upstate New York, and that it needs to be, that our children need to know more about that history. It gives us a different sense of what it means to be here. So after that letter, the director of OCC, Greg Tripoli, gave me a call and said, okay, let's do it. So what's culturally distinctive about Onondaga Lake is a sacred place for the founding of the Great Law of Peace. Nowadays they put it around 903 CE, but it's probably much earlier than that. That's based on more recent archaeological evidence. And it's the story of Kadadaho, the peacemaker, and Iwenta, and also Chigonsace. But it's also first contact with Jesuit missionaries. And yes, we have a fort, and kids love forts. Just as I was saying, the Hiawatha belt and the flag refers to the lake. The original belt is held by the Onondaga. I got to see it a few summers ago. And it's a very powerful thing just to look at the original belt. We have facsimiles of this belt at the center as well, if you go out. Recently, a U.S. coin. This is a rendering of the design for the coin. The belt wrapped around the original 5 arrows. If you look at a dollar bill, the eagle has in its talon a clutch of 13 arrows. That notion of unity and strength is taken from the Haudenosaunee in some famous speeches from the 18th century. Anyway, but comes right out of the lake. These are a few events that we've supported a while back now. One of the issues I'm interested in, being in religion, is the doctrine of Christian discovery, which is, I don't want to go into it too much. We can maybe, if you like, but basically it's a series of papal bulls by 14th, 15th century popes that in effect gave the entire world to Christian explorers. If a Christian comes into the land of non-Christian people, the land is automatically deeded over to the Christian explorer. So this sounds like 15th century crazy religion talk, but be careful, because it's still basically a feature of U.S. property law after Supreme Court ruling in 1823, and even upheld as late as 2005, right, in Oneida. So for indigenous peoples around the world, not just native people here, but indigenous people around the world, the doctrine of discovery is a kind of urgent issue that has to do with land resource extraction.
I've heard somewhere that the Catholic Church has not rescinded that from traditional Catholic doctrine, and it's still, they've never repudiated it. Do you know about that?
Yeah, there is an attempt, and it could be that there's been an audience with the Pope extended to some of the leadership here around the globe to try to figure out how they can make that repudiation. But a lot of Christian churches have repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery, including that group that we had meet at the center. We had Episcopalians and Disciples of Christ and Methodists and others, and they all had documents of World Council of Churches made a statement to this effect. But the Catholic Church is not part of the World Council of Churches, right? So they're their own thing. In fact, they have their own seat in the UN. So they're a very powerful voice. And but there's a lot of back and forth, and it gets into, Catholic juridical process and what is really functioning in the church and what isn't. The real interesting issue is how this Catholic doctrine of, 500 plus years ago transitions into a Protestant nation-building project, legal construct. And it's not really a law, it's more of a principle of law, I mean, if you think about where does title begin, those kinds of fundamental issues go right back to the Doctrine of Discovery, right? So it's really a deep issue, and so that's one of my interests, is bringing together legal scholars and people in religion to talk about that.
Did you mention the title of that poster? Or?
Yeah. This guy is crazy. He's hysterical, and his name is escaping me. But his family home was appropriated by the Nazis, some small town in Germany, and he lived in upstate New York. And he decided, well, he was going to ask the Mohawks to go back to Germany with him to ask the Germans to return his home, or something like that. I mean, it was really funny, is the thing. And cow Jews is actually a technical term. They were actually cow Jews. That was what they could do, so it's a translation of some term. And so we were dealing with all this heavy stuff at the conference with Doctrine of Discovery, and we showed this film, and everybody was just guffawing. It was so funny. I mean, so it was sort of absurd, like watching, for example, they just happened to coordinate it with a native powwow with all these Germans dressed as Indians, and they have the biggest powwows in the world in Germany, who knew? So it's just sort of this absurd kind of thing having to do with land and appropriation of land and all that sort of thing. So anyway, he's a real character. We've had other symposia through, like the Humanities Center, listening to the wampum, a number of presentations on wampum, Indigenous perspectives on museums and cultural centers. We've proposed something, I think, for this latest round coming up. This is Rick Hill talking about wampum history. Rick helped us develop the center, some of the ideas there around the center. He was our consultant, a well-known cultural historian from Six Nations in Canada. This is Chief Irving Powless. He gave a talk out there on wampum. You can see the two-row wampum over the... he is designated the wampum keeper in Onondaga. There's a colleague of mine, David Carrasco from Harvard at OCC. That was part of the wampum event. And he does Latin America, pre-Columbian traditions, Aztec, Maya, and was interested in connecting wampum with other indigenous textual media. And Oren Lyons with the Remembrance Belt at noñh College. That was an interesting conversation. between the Jesuits, and because as you can imagine, the Onondaga version of what happened at the fort in the 17th century is quite different than the Jesuit version in the Jesuit relations, and yet the Jesuits are always cited because that's a textual resource. So the question is, how do you bring in these other indigenous texts? Oral tradition it's called, but it's much more than that. So how do we make that part of the conversation? And so, you know, we had an interesting back and forth at Lemoyne. Also lacrosse, you know, lacrosse features in the story of the formation of the league in a variety of ways. So we, in 13, we had a wooden stick festival out at the lake, and lacrosse is very powerful. We just had the men's lacrosse team out at the Scano Center. We fed them a lot of food, and then Tadadaho and I told them about the legacy of lacrosse coming out of the lake, and that there was there are different hotbeds of lacrosse. Anyone who knows lacrosse knows that Baltimore is one, and Long Island's another, and Boston or whatever. But this is a hotbed too, but it's fundamentally different than all those others because it's been played here since time immemorial. So that's, their eyes kind of got wide at that point, like, what is this? And I said, well, now you're into this. Now you're part of this, and we got to tell them those stories at the lake. So I hope to do more of that. This is stick maker. Now I've just got photos, okay? So stick maker Alf Jocks at the lake. Alf, I teach a class called Religion and Sports, largely out of lacrosse, and I can't find a room big enough these days to teach it, but every year I have Alf come up and speak. Usually sets up on the quad, but we're going to be setting up a life science atrium this year, and he'll give a stick demonstration on the 26th at 9:30 if you want to try to horn in on it. So this was at the lake. We had old sticks playing at the lake, and this was a very moving experience for many of these men because, to know about the legacy of lacrosse at the lake, and we found, like news clippings of games that were played in the 19th century and things. So this was a very important event for a lot of people. Thompson Brothers, if you know them, they came out and talked to the kids. This was before they were really famous, but they were pretty famous. And Tadadaho with his son. This is a group from Gettysburg. We're going to have them up again. It was a public service class. They spent 10 days here at the Nation, and all. This is before we were open, okay? The Scano Center. This year, there's a group of like 6 coming up. We just happened to catch a game at the Nation, and Orrin happened to be there, so they were just thrilled. This is the kind of thing we can do too, small, like clinics and that sort of thing. It was a great group of kids. This was, now this fellow here, his name is Fei Bao, and some kind of reality star in Chinese television, and just came through on his bike with this group and stopped at the Scano Center, and we weren't even open, but they were so enthusiastic about it. People around the world know more about the Haudenosaunee relationship to American democracy than we do. We could talk about why we don't, or why it's been kept from us. But anyway, so this was very, nobody understood one another, but it was really fun. During the last World Indoor Lacrosse Championship, they had this conference called Consciousness, Peace, Equity, and Friendship, and I thought it was never going to work. You have a conference in the middle of a sporting event, are you crazy? But it ended up working pretty well, and we were a co-sponsor on that, so that was fun. At the World Games, we got to meet, these are my twin boys, Clay and Croy. They're sports, they're lacrosse enthusiasts. They got to meet Jim Brown and Al Gore at dinner. And this is the opening ceremony at the War Memorial last September. And then a box game in the dome. That was very exciting. And what was more exciting for me is that this is taken from the Chancellor's box. The Chancellor opened up his box to the Native students and stuff, and he was really enthusiastic about it. So this was huge, I think. Just setting up a box in the dome was enormous, and goes to the point of, you know, putting up the flag in the dome. I think it's not so much a stretch these days. And Oren giving the wampum belt. Unfortunately, the Canadian team won, but he gave them the one bowl, one spoon wampum belt that indicates that we're all together in this world. And so that was a nice moment. Already we've gotten grants or been, you know, participating in grants. NEH Digital Humanities grant for an online atlas of the oral history of the Onondaga Lake. Jane Reed here in geography, and Rachel May. Also an EPA grant. I never thought I'd be working on an EPA grant in my life. I'm in the humanities, you know, so this is like the furthest thing from my mind. But they won. The title of it was the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address as a Pathway to Stewardship Education in Onondaga Lake Watershed. So we're developing a curriculum that's easily downloadable for schools and teachers, because teachers just don't have any materials that they can use in class. So we want to connect it with the education. This was our opening on November 21st. This was an interesting meeting too. That's Starhawk. I don't know if any of you know Starhawk. She was here in town, but she wanted to come, and that's my student Abel here, who's really into Starhawk. So she's a New Age person from California. Has been in the New Age movement for 40, 50 years or something, and wanted to see this kind of stuff. This is Roy Simmons Jr. talking to a group of museum studies students. This is actually in Manley Fieldhouse, but he's also they've worked on an exhibit for Bird Library on the 100-year anniversary of lacrosse at SU. This was another visitor. He's a lawyer who works with the Ainu people in Hokkaido, Japan. This happened a couple weeks ago. We're there with Joe Heath, General Counsel of Onondaga Nation, Tadadaho City Hill, having lunch. And so we were that's the kind of thing also that we're into, meeting with Indigenous people. We've had Maori people and all kinds of people visiting already. This is a group of Indigenous law students from Harvard University that visited a week ago or so. And these are just some of the images of the center as you go through. So Nyawan Hiskano is the first principle that you learn about, then the Thanksgiving address, again a video combined with text and touch screens. The creation narrative, then you begin to learn about the Great Law of Peace. And I should say, all of these things take they take an enormous amount of time to recite in the Longhouse. So we've reduced like 30 hours of interviews to like 4-minute segments. So it's very artificial, but it's just really, we just try to get people to understand sort of the basics. This is a depiction of peacemaker in Iowantha and the condolence. The great tree of peace in the center of the place. Then upstairs you'll learn about the gathering of the good mind, or the great law of peace at Onondaga Lake. The wampum gallery, these are all important wampums that have to do with the pre-contact world of the Haudenosaunee. And then a depiction of the Longhouse and the Grand Council. And then we get to the first encounters, first impressions, first encounters. Doctrine of Discovery of a timeline from 1452 to 2005. And then these are some of the wampums. This wampum was a 2-row wampum that was with the Dutch in 1613. And there are other treaties as well that we get into here. We wanted to talk about the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, which was an attack by George Washington on the Haudenosaunee in 1779, and also the Treaty of Canandaigua in 1794. This is the George Washington wampum belt, with some stuff having to do with the beaver. This is the Gaiweo, or the Code of Hanson Lake. And they particularly wanted us to emphasize the boarding school experience, which led to devastations in basically every Native family throughout the country. So they wanted us to emphasize that. So then, and then you go back down the stairs and you see that they're still here. There's resilience and survival of people, the roots of Western democracy, the cross. These are all the influences of Haudenosaunee on people today. These are some of the cases with baskets and artistry. The cross sticks, the women's movement in the U.S., environmental concerns, protecting Mother Earth, international work in the United Nations. They've been very active in the United Nations. This is depicting the first trip in, the first delegation in 1977, in recent times. And Native American foods, the Three Sisters. So that's